The assembly line didn't stop because of a strike. It stopped because of 7 words. 7 words spoken from a podium in Ottawa on a Wednesday afternoon. 7 words delivered without notes, without theater, without a single raised voice. And by the time Washington decoded what those 7 words actually meant, $419 billion had already evaporated from the American financial system. Not over months, not over weeks, 38 hours. Here is what mainstream media will not tell you. The 50% tariff that the President of the United States announced from the East Room on that Monday afternoon, the largest single-step trade escalation against an allied economy in 89 years of modern American trade architecture, did not wound Canada. It triggered Canada. There is a difference. A wound is reactive. A trigger is mechanical. And what Canada triggered in the 90 minutes following that East Room announcement had been engineered, war-gamed, pre-positioned, and loaded across 22 separate financial institutions over the preceding 19 months, waiting for exactly this moment, this scale, this provocation. Washington thought it was playing trade war. Canada had already moved to a different battlefield entirely. In this video, you will understand precisely how that battlefield shift was engineered. You will understand what Annex 7 actually was, and why its activation was more devastating than any counter-tariff Canada could have deployed. You will understand why Warren Buffett made 5 phone calls within 1 hour of Mark Carney's statement. And you will understand why central bank reserve committees from Frankfurt to Singapore have since printed those 7 words onto their standing operating procedures. This is not a story about tariffs. This is a story about doctrine. About the moment a smaller nation permanently restructured the rules of economic confrontation with the most powerful economy on Earth. Subscribe now, because what happens next will not wait. The timestamp matters. Monday, 2:47 in the afternoon, Eastern Time. The President of the United States stood at the East Room lectern, flanked by 2 flags and 1 trade advisor whose face had gone slightly pale in the previous 90 seconds. And announced that effective at 12:01 in the morning the following Thursday, the United States would impose a 50% tariff on every category of Canadian goods crossing the southern border, not 25%, not the staged escalation the White House Communications Office had been signaling for 3 weeks, 50, the largest single-step tariff escalation against an allied economy in 89 years of modern American trade architecture. The president read the figure from a teleprompter, looked up, and added 1 sentence that had not appeared in the prepared remarks distributed to the press pool. Let's see how long they last. No procedural off-ramp, no negotiating window, no consultation clause, no exemption schedule, no transition period, no diplomatic back channel referenced, just the flat declaration of a 50% wall at the busiest commercial border on Earth, scheduled to materialize in 62 hours. Washington was not bluffing. Washington was not posturing. Washington was operating on an assumption so deeply embedded in 84 years of bilateral trade confrontation that no one in the National Economic Council had thought to question it. The assumption was this: Canada would respond symmetrically. Canada would match the escalation at the goods trade layer, counter tariffs on American exports, retaliatory measures calibrated to mirror the pressure applied. The same doctrine that had governed every bilateral trade confrontation since 1947. The assumption was correct about one thing: Canada's retaliatory options at the goods trade layer were genuinely limited. Canadian imports accounted for only 14% of total United States export flows. A counter-tariff response at that layer would damage Canada as much as it damaged Washington. And the American political system had repeatedly demonstrated it was prepared to absorb that damage as the acceptable cost of confrontation. Washington had done the math. The math was right. They had just solved the wrong equation entirely. 412 miles northeast of the East Room, the Canadian ambassador to the United States was sitting in a meeting at the Brookings Institution when the announcement reached her phone. According to 3 members of her staff who later described the moment, she did not react. She continued the meeting for another 11 minutes. She thanked the panel. She walked to her car. She made 1 phone call. 41 seconds. The call did not contain outrage, requests for guidance, procedural questions, or any of the standard diplomatic vocabulary that an escalation of that magnitude would normally produce. The call contained 5 words: execute the contingency tonight. Inside the Privy Council office, the contingency had been referenced for 14 months as Annex 7. Inside the Bank of Canada, it had been called the Mirror Provision. Inside the Department of Finance, it had been called simply the File. Whatever name it carried, it had been drafted, reviewed, war-gamed, rehearsed, and pre-positioned across 22 separate Canadian government and financial institutions, built specifically for the scenario the president had just produced from the East Room lectern. This is where most analysts stop. They see a trade escalation. They see a diplomatic response. They draw a line between cause and effect and call it a story. That is not the story. The story is what Washington had failed to read across the preceding 30 months while it was constructing its escalation posture. The story is the architecture Canada had been quietly, technically, and deliberately assembling in the spaces Washington had assumed were empty. The story is the difference between a nation that was preparing to absorb a blow and a nation that had spent 19 months engineering the precise conditions under which that blow would trigger a response its sender could not survive. Washington had mapped the battlefield. They had just mapped the wrong one. To understand what Annex 7 actually was, you need to forget everything you think you know about how trade wars are fought. Forget counter tariffs. Forget retaliatory import restrictions. Forget the standard symmetrical playbook that has governed bilateral economic confrontation between sovereign nations for the better part of a century. Because Canada did not fight this battle at the layer where Washington was waiting, Canada fought it at the layer Washington had spent 30 months leaving completely undefended. Here is the architecture. 19 months before the East Room announcement, a 301-page internal memorandum, later partially declassified and reported by Reuters, circulated through the Privy Council office in Ottawa. The memo's central argument was surgical. 30 months of escalating American economic confrontation had produced a structural opportunity that no Canadian government had ever previously possessed. The opportunity to respond to maximum pressure American escalation, not with a symmetrical counterstrike, but with a response that operated at an entirely different layer of the bilateral relationship. The memo identified that layer with precision, not goods trade, not import restrictions, not the 14% of American export flows that Canada could theoretically threaten, and which Washington had already priced in as acceptable collateral damage. The memo targeted the layer that Washington had treated for 78 years as the unconditional foundation of American sovereign financial power, the layer of bilateral capital flows, treasury holdings, and the cross-border financial settlement architecture that underpinned American sovereign credit pricing in global markets. This was not a sanction, not a freeze, not a hostile divestment. It was something far more precise, far more deniable, and far more devastating. The memo recommended that any maximum pressure American escalation be met with a coordinated, prearranged, technically routine acceleration of disengagement from the financial architecture that priced American sovereign debt. Every individual instrument already disclosed in standard regulatory filings. Every individual instrument already operational on paper. The execution sequence would simply activate all of them simultaneously across a 96-hour window, time to arrive in the bond market 26 hours before the tariff arrived at the border. The weapon was not any single instrument. The weapon was the sequence. At 8:47 in the evening on Monday, 90 minutes after the East Room announcement, Annex 7 activated. What followed across the next 96 hours was the most consequential coordinated financial maneuver in the modern history of the bilateral relationship. The Bank of Canada confirmed the routine settlement of $84 billion in cross-border commercial transactions through the multilateral clearing framework in Zurich, rather than through the legacy correspondent banking architecture in New York. A transaction volume that had been migrating for 30 months, but had never previously been completed in a single 24-hour window. The Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, and the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation, managing a combined $2.84 trillion in assets, confirmed the scheduled completion of a long-projected rebalancing that reduced their aggregate holdings of American sovereign and corporate paper by $187 billion across that same 96-hour window. The Department of Finance confirmed the scheduled execution of prearranged currency swap activations with the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the Reserve Bank of Australia, and the Swiss National Bank, with combined facility capacity of $341 billion deployable across 14 days. Each instrument, taken individually, was routine. Each instrument had been disclosed. Each instrument was legal. Each instrument had been operational on paper for between 9 and 22 months. There was nothing to sanction, nothing to negotiate against, nothing to reverse through executive order or emergency legislation. The American architecture had no defensive instruments at the layer where the Canadian response had been delivered. The Treasury cannot impose a tariff on the absence of foreign demand for its bonds. The markets understood this before Washington did. At 4:14 in the morning Eastern Time on Tuesday, Asian trading desks began pricing the disclosed acceleration. By the time European markets opened, the 10-year United States Treasury yield had moved 31 basis points overnight. By the time New York opened, it had moved another 19. By Tuesday's close, the 10-year had moved 71 basis points in a single session, the largest single-session move in the modern history of the United States Treasury market. The Federal Reserve activated $410 billion in pre-positioned liquidity facilities within 7 hours of the European Open, the largest emergency deployment in Federal Reserve history outside of a declared financial crisis. It was insufficient. The 30-year Treasury auction on Wednesday afternoon cleared at a bid-to-cover ratio of 1.81, the lowest ratio recorded in 31 years of auction data. Quantitative algorithms across every major fixed-income desk recalibrated their entire sovereign credit assumption sets in real time. The repricing was not discretionary. It was mechanical, automatic, unstoppable. By Thursday's close, the first full trading day under the 50% tariff regime, the damage was categorical. The Standard & Poor's 500 had fallen 5.4% on volume 91% above the trailing 30-day average. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had shed 1,840 points. The Nasdaq had lost 6.1%. The United States dollar had weakened against the Canadian dollar by 5.7%, against the euro by 4.1%, against the yen by 4.8%, and against the Swiss franc by 6.2%. The DXY index recorded its largest single-session decline in 27 years. Goldman Sachs issued a client note on Thursday morning. The calculation was unambiguous. The cumulative direct cost to the United States of the 38-hour window between Annex 7's activation and the tariff's effective date, $284 billion in market capitalization destruction, $94 billion in sovereign credit repricing, and $41 billion in projected additional Treasury financing costs across the following 4 quarters. $419 billion, generated by 90 minutes of presidential commentary that the National Economic Council had projected would extract approximately $61 billion from Canada across 18 months. J.P. Morgan downgraded the United States sovereign rating outlook to credit watch within 31 minutes of Carney's Wednesday statement. Moody's matched within 2 hours. Fitch matched within 5, and the tariff had not yet taken effect. This is what asymmetric financial warfare looks like when it has been engineered with 19 months of precision, executed across 22 institutions in 96 hours, and timed to arrive at the layer where the opposing architecture has concentrated its most catastrophic structural exposure. Washington escalated at the goods trade layer, Canada responded at the sovereign credit layer, and at the sovereign credit layer, the American architecture had no answer. The numbers do not bleed. $419 billion is a figure that exists comfortably in a Goldman Sachs client note. It lives on a Bloomberg terminal. It moves through a congressional briefing document without friction, without weight, without the specific gravity of a human life absorbing its consequences in real time. So let us leave the terminal Let us leave the auction room and the reserve committee and the quantitative algorithm recalibrating its sovereign credit assumptions at 4 in the morning. Let us go to Windsor. Windsor, Ontario, sits directly across the Detroit River from the city, whose name has become synonymous with American industrial identity. The Ambassador Bridge, 1.8 miles of steel cable and concrete, carries approximately 25% of all merchandise trade between Canada and the United States across its deck every single day. On a normal Tuesday morning, a commercial vehicle crosses that bridge every 22 seconds. On the Tuesday morning following Annex 7's activation, the crossing frequency did not change. The cargo did. Marco DeLuca has worked the body assembly line at the Stellantis Windsor assembly plant for 22 years. He is not an economist. He does not read Privy Council memoranda or monitor bid-to-cover ratios on 30-year Treasury auctions. What he knows is shift schedules, torque specifications, and the particular sound a line makes when it is running at full capacity versus the sound it makes when something upstream has gone wrong. At 5:47 in the morning on Tuesday, Marco's phone did not ring. It was supposed to ring. The automated shift confirmation system contacts every line worker 90 minutes before their scheduled start. The call confirms the line is running. The call is so routine, so structurally embedded in the rhythm of the plant's operation that most workers stop consciously registering it. They simply know that if the phone does not ring, the line is not running. Marco's phone did not ring because the Stellantis Financial Operations Division had completed a bilateral settlement migration the previous evening. A technically routine rebalancing of cross-border payment infrastructure that altered the cost structure of Windsor Assembly's integrated supply chain with sufficient immediacy that 3 hours of production had been suspended pending recalculation. Marco did not know what a bilateral settlement migration was. He knew his phone had not rung. He sat at his kitchen table in Windsor and drank his coffee and watched the Ambassador Bridge through his window, the same bridge he has watched from various windows for 22 years. And he tried to understand what had happened to his Tuesday morning. Across the river, a different reckoning was underway. At 4:14 in the morning Eastern Time, a fixed-income portfolio manager at a major institutional desk in New York received an alert that Asian trading had begun pricing the Annex 7 disclosures. By 6 in the morning, she had been on 4 calls. By 8, she had been on 11. By the time New York markets opened, she had not slept, and her coffee had gone cold twice, and she was explaining to a senior partner why the 10-year Treasury yield movement overnight represented something categorically different from a normal repricing event. It was not a liquidity problem, she said. It was an architecture problem. You cannot negotiate your way out of an architecture problem in a single morning. You cannot deploy emergency liquidity against the structural absence of foreign demand. You cannot reverse 19 months of deliberate, disclosed, legally unimpeachable institutional repositioning through executive pressure or emergency legislative action. The governor of Michigan understood this before Washington did. Her state's chief economist had been reading Canadian financial regulatory disclosures for 14 months, the same disclosures that Annex 7's instruments had been filed under, and had completed parallel preparation across Michigan's automotive sector, specifically against the scenario that had now materialized. The governors of Ohio, Texas, and California confirmed parallel preparation in their respective industrial sectors. The governors whose economists had read the filings survived. The workers in the states whose leadership had trusted Washington's assessment of Canadian retaliatory capacity and had prepared for a symmetrical counter-tariff that never came, absorbed the asymmetric impact without preparation, without hedging, without the 19 months of quiet structural repositioning that had insulated the other side. Marco's phone did not ring on Tuesday morning. It did not ring because somewhere in the intersection of a presidential ad lib and a 41-second phone call and 22 financial institutions executing a pre-positioned sequence, the cost structure of his Tuesday had been recalculated by forces operating at a layer so far above his kitchen table that the distance between them is almost incomprehensible. Almost. The empty chair on the line tells the story more clearly than any Goldman Sachs client note ever could. The tariff took effect at 12:01 in the morning on Thursday. By 12:01 in the morning on Thursday, it was already operationally irrelevant, not because it had been reversed, not because a diplomatic settlement had been reached across the 62-hour window between the East Room announcement and the border effective time. The tariff was operationally irrelevant because the battlefield on which it had been deployed no longer existed in the form Washington had assumed when it deployed it. The financial architecture that had underwritten American escalation leverage across 84 years of bilateral confrontation had been quietly, legally, and irrevocably restructured in the preceding 96 hours. You cannot impose a tariff on a settlement system that has already migrated to Zurich. You cannot negotiate the return of pension fund rebalancing that has already been completed, disclosed, and filed under routine regulatory frameworks. You cannot compel sovereign nations to reverse monetary policy decisions made by their own central banks within their own legally established mandates. The American political system had been constructed to respond at the goods trade layer. The response had been delivered at the sovereign credit layer. And at the sovereign credit layer, the American architecture had concentrated 30 months of structural exposure without ever building a single defensive instrument. The cascade did not stop at the border. From Frankfurt to Singapore, from Tokyo to Zurich, the reserve committees of central banks that had watched the 96-hour sequence with forensic attention began a process that will define the architecture of bilateral economic confrontation for the next generation. The 7 words Mark Carney delivered from the Sir John A. Macdonald building on Wednesday afternoon, 9 hours and 14 minutes before the tariff took effect, were not a statement of Canadian policy. They were a demonstration of operational doctrine. An operational doctrine, once demonstrated at scale with $419 billion in verifiable consequence, does not remain the exclusive property of the nation that deployed it. Every smaller economy that has spent years absorbing maximum pressure escalation from a larger trading partner now possesses a working model, a demonstrated sequence. A disclosed, legal, technically routine architecture that redirects confrontation away from the layer where the larger party is strongest and toward the layer where the larger party has concentrated its deepest structural exposure. Canada did not just respond to Washington. Canada exported a doctrine. Warren Buffett, watching from Omaha, had articulated the strategic shift with the particular economy of language that has characterized his most consequential observations across 6 decades. Symmetry, he said, was the gift the United States used to give its enemies. The smart ones stopped accepting it. The question that now inhabits every Treasury auction room, every congressional budget office, every kitchen table from Detroit to Des Moines is not the question Washington entered that Monday afternoon believing it was asking. Washington believed it was asking how long Canada would last. The question that emerged from the 38-hour window is fundamentally different. Can the United States restore the doctrine of symmetrical retaliation, the doctrine that has structured its bilateral escalation leverage for 84 years? After the smaller party has demonstrated with $419 billion in operational consequence that the doctrine no longer governs the relationship? Or has the inversion itself, in being deployed once and being demonstrated to be repeatable, already foreclosed every escalation pathway the American political system was architecturally constructed to deploy? What exactly is the larger party threatening when the smaller party has diversified its exposure at the layer where the larger party is escalating and concentrated its response at the layer where the larger party has no defense? The assembly line in Windsor is running again, slower than before, at a cost structure that did not exist on Sunday. With a supply chain architecture that has been permanently repositioned away from the correspondent banking infrastructure in New York and toward the multilateral clearing framework in Zurich, the line is running. But the assumptions underneath it, the assumptions about leverage, about symmetry, about which nation holds the structural advantage in the next escalation, those assumptions did not survive the 38-hour window. They will not be rebuilt. The tariff is at the border. The doctrine is everywhere else. We do not match, we invert. If you understand what just happened, and more importantly, what happens next, subscribe, because this is not the last time someone inverts. And the next time, Washington may not have $419 billion left to spend discovering it.